Hello? Hello? Everyone? Welcome, everyone. Shh. Okay. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the IMA lecture, public lecture. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Naomi Leonard. Naomi Leonard is the Edwin Willey Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton University, where she's also a faculty member in the program in Applied and Computational Mathematics. Professor Leonard received her PhD from the University of Maryland in 1994. Her research area is system science, which is a study of how systems, those that arrive in nature, in society, and science, behave. In her work, she uses very deep mathematical ideas to understand and explain phenomena observed in complex systems. Moreover, she's been able to apply her research results to practical work. In 2004, Professor Leonard was awarded the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. The MacArthur Fellowship is referred to on the streets as the Genius Award and is given to a person who show exceptional merit and promise for continued and enhanced creative work. She was elected Fellow of the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers in 2007. Other honors include the National Science Foundation Career Award and the Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award. The subject of the talk tonight is about her effort to understand how animals move as a group and how mathematics can help understand this phenomenon and how her work can be applied to the design of robots that could behave like a swarm. So without further ado, please welcome Naomi Leonard.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
How's that? Can you hear me now? Okay, so I'll stand a little bit closer. So thanks again for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, in my talk tonight, I have three goals. My first goal is to give you some insight into how complex motion of a group as a whole can emerge from a collection of relatively simple individuals. Okay? And my second goal tonight is to show you how it's possible and why it's so illuminating to think about and study both natural groups and robotic groups as part of the same story. Okay. Okay, can you hear me? All right, very good. So my third goal then is to impress upon you the role of what we call feedback in all of this. So by feedback, I mean the responsive decision-making of individuals, and therefore how we can use mathematical models and analysis for understanding feedback to make a formal investigation of collective motion. Okay, so those are my three goals. Now, by a group, I mean a collection of individuals, so let's call them agents, where every agent in the group can move around independently on its own, under its own power. And every agent in the group can also sense something about its environment, whether it be the external world, something about what's going on in the external environment, or whether it be something about what the motion of others in the group nearby are doing. And then thirdly, every individual in the group should be able to, on their own, respond to what they can sense. So independently make decisions about how they want to respond to what they sense. So by this definition, a group can be a collection of natural agents. So an animal group like this herd of zebra or this flock of birds or this school of dolphins, right? Because every individual in this group can either walk, run, fly, swim on their own. Every individual in this group can sense, so they can They can either see, hear, smell, touch, taste, and so they can sense something about their external world and also about, what their neighbors are doing, how their neighbors are moving. And certainly each individual in these animal groups can make decisions on their own about how they're going to respond to what they sense. But likewise, we can think about groups of robotic agents. So, like teams of robots that are going to move around on land or in the air or in space or on Mars or underwater, possibly to do things like working together to do environmental monitoring or to explore new terrain like the surface of Mars or to do a search and rescue mission collectively. And here they're a group in the same sense because here each robotic individual can, as you see in these pictures, can possibly walk or drive on its own, or it can fly, or it can swim and dive. So it can move around independently. It also can be equipped with sensors, so it can measure something about its environment or also measure something about the other robots around it. And it can be equipped with a computer so that it can make its own decisions, if we program it correctly, so that it can respond to what it senses. Okay, so in both cases we have these kinds of groups. Now you've looked up in the sky and you've looked in the ocean, so I don't think it's hard to appreciate that the sort of remarkable behaviors that we see, that we observe animal groups doing, can provide enormous inspiration for design of robotic teams and robotic networks. So, for example, in this video I'm showing you here of the school of fish, they're obviously moving in these very beautiful patterns. But they're more than beautiful. The biologists tell us that they move like this for a whole variety of important reasons, like being able to be really good at foraging for food as a team, being able to be really good at migrating when they need to move on, being really good at being able to avoid predators. And so we'd really like to be able to do the same kinds of things with our robotic agents. Can we think about enabling robotic agents to work together so that they are efficient foragers of information, say, or very careful avoiders of hazards? So, in fact, on the right here, I have an animation of a robotic ocean sampling network. So this is a group of robots that, with my collaborators, we developed and then demonstrated in Monterey Bay, California. So that's where this animation is taking place. That's Monterey Bay, California. And so here the idea is that these robots should move around and collect data under the sea. For instance, collecting data on the ocean physics, like temperature and salinity and ocean currents, and also even on the biology, so measuring something about the concentration of the plankton and perhaps the fish and what else is going on down there, all towards being able to derive a better understanding of the dynamics of the coastal ocean, the ecosystem, the role of the ocean in climate change, all these various kinds of problems. And our goal in this context is to think about how to design on these robotic agents that, again, are moving around. They are equipped with sensors to take measurements, how to design them so that they respond in a way so they, like the school of fish, are efficient foragers of useful information despite stormy seas and all the challenges of doing things in the dark, cold environment of the ocean. So I do want to make one point, though. I want to emphasize that this whole story is not about biomimicry. So we're not trying to look at the biology and copy it and put it inside the robots. Okay? Robots and animals are very, very different. They behave differently. It just wouldn't make sense to do that. Instead, what we're trying to do is see if we can develop an understanding for the underlying principles and mechanisms that connect what individuals do, what they decide in response to what they sense, how that's connected to what happens at the level of the group. Okay, this is what we're trying to do. And it leads to a number of challenging questions. So for instance, in order to develop this connection between individual decisions and group behavior, we have to understand, for example, what are the interactions of individuals, or what kinds of interactions between individuals, and what kinds of decisions by individuals will lead to, for example, high-performing groups. How do we understand that? And how do we develop a means to predict this? How can we come up with a formal way to understand and predict so that we can think about understanding what's going on in the animal groups and then designing robotic groups? So for instance, what kinds of interconnections and what kinds of decision rules for individuals would lead to fast decision making? What kinds of decisions and interactions would lead to efficient collection of resource? Suppose that robots are supposed to go around and collect information very efficiently. What about the ability of the group to make decisions and move around despite there being all kinds of unanticipated things going on, say under the water? So, and how is it that birds can fly in these groups and do such a good job despite the winds and despite sometimes there being a predator and despite there being trees in the way? How are they able to function as a group in the presence of uncertainties and disturbances from the environment? So these kinds of questions actually push the limits of what we know. So what biologists know about how animals behave, and it also pushes the limits of what we can reliably design into robotic networks. And so we like to think, or I like to think of this as kind of a joint problem, right? Where on the one hand, we want to explain the enabling mechanisms in animal groups, and on the other hand, we want to derive provable, mechanisms for robotic groups. So provable so that we have guarantees of how the group will behave if we give the individual certain decisions. So one can think about this integrated approach, thinking about the animals in tandem with the robotics, because we have the same kinds of questions. In one case, we want to go backwards. We want to look at the group and observe the behavior and answer questions about what the individuals are doing. In the other case, we want to say, well, this is what we'd like the group to do. How should we design the individuals to get there? Now, the key to all this is really this notion of feedback. And as I mentioned, feedback refers to the responsive decisions and the responsive behavior of individuals to what they sense. So, in fact, feedback is responsible for the functioning of just about any system in nature and engineering that changes with time. Okay, so from systems, just about every system in your body, to the heating system in your house, to your DVD player, to the airplanes you fly on, feedback is used to help regulate and help the system perform, despite there being all kinds of sort of unanticipated events and disturbances and uncertainty about the environment that these systems have to work in. So what I'm showing you here is a little cartoon of what feedback actually is. And since the idea is that we want to come up with mathematical ways to understand this is a nice sort of schematic to think about the different components to feedback. Okay, so we have some kind of system. Maybe it's the system in your body, and it's behaving in a certain way, and these are the 3 steps in the feedback loop, as we call it. So the first step is that the system should have some way to measure how it's behaving. Okay, has to be able to sense what's going on in itself or in its environment. And then it has to apply a rule. It has to come up with a way to say, okay, given how I'm behaving and maybe how I'd like to behave, how am I going to respond? Okay, then thirdly, it has to act, right? It has to actually implement the response, and that goes back into the system. Okay, you just keep doing this again and again and again, and this is feedback, and this is what provides all of these kinds of systems the ability to regulate and perform. So just to illustrate, this is kind of a mundane but illustrative example. Think about your car and its cruise control system, or if you don't have a car, maybe your parents' car and its cruise control system. So here the system, what does it measure? Well, first of all, what is it that it wants to do, right? You punch in, say, 55 miles per hour. You'd like the car to go 55 miles per hour. So it's going to try to accomplish this for you. And so the system has to, first of all, it has to measure something, and it measures the speed the car is actually going, right? And then, so that's sense. And then we have to apply a rule. Well, the natural thing is to compare how fast you want to go, 55 miles per hour, to how fast you're actually going, and come up with a rule. So then naturally the rule is you're going to want to go faster if you're going below 55 miles per hour, and you want to go slower if you're going more than 55 miles per hour. But there's lots of different ways to do that, right? So you may have all kinds of design issues that you want to think about. Like you want to make sure that you don't overshoot, right? Because then you might get a ticket if you go too fast. You probably want to make sure that you don't do it in too jerky a way, because then the people in the back seat are going to be really angry, or maybe they'll get sick. And you probably don't want to make it go too slow, because then you'll be really impatient. So there's lots of things to think about. You might even want to make sure that the system is somehow able to regulate, you know, in the case that it's raining out, or in case that you're going uphill or downhill. So you might want it to be somewhat adaptive in its rule to what's going on outside. Okay, so that's the rule, and then you act, right? You take that rule, and then you literally have the system push down or let up on the accelerator to actually close the loop and finish the feedback. Okay, so this is cruise control, but now let's think about our problem of lots of individuals, lots of fish, or lots of robots in this group that's trying to work together, and things are starting to get very complicated. Okay, so what I've told you already, we do have lots of mathematical tools to try to help us weigh these different trade-offs and make these design choices so that we can get systems to behave how we want them to behave and trade off different kinds of design issues. But now things start to get really complicated because, I mean, here I've drawn that same picture, the same feedback loop for 3 fish, okay? But look how messy it already looks, right? Because every fish or every robot has to measure its environment, so maybe it's sensing something about, you know, the temperature outside, or maybe it's sensing something about how much food is nearby, and maybe it's sensing its neighbor. Okay, this fish started to go this way. Hey, I want to stick with this guy. He must know something. So it's measuring its local environment, and then it's determining a rule, right? So things like avoid bumping into something, or somebody else, or, you know, follow this guy because he seems to know something. He's just made a sharp turn to the right. So this would be my rule, and then I have to act. So then I literally have to actually turn or accelerate or decelerate in response to my rule, and I close the loop. But, you know, you notice these little red arrows here. This is where things start to get very complicated, right? Because fish number 1 is maybe sensing fish number 2, who's sensing fish number 1, who's sensing fish number 3, who's sensing fish number 2. And so then, you know, all of these boxes and all of these rules start to get very complicated. And this is where things start to push the limits of the kinds of things that we currently know how to do in a very systematic way. Okay, so let's talk about those little boxes, those 3 components of feedback in a little bit more depth, okay? So the first one, the one that's starting to suggest the complexity of this kind of problem, is that sense box, right? Because we have all these arrows between all the different individuals in our group. Okay, so we have ways of sort of keeping track of that. We really want to be able to keep track of who's sensing whom at any given moment, because that's pretty critical to how the system is going to behave. Okay, so this is a way to sort of encode that. And so what I'm showing you here, now I have 6 fish, or 6 robots, and every purple dot represents a single fish or a single robot. Okay, so and I've labeled them 1 to 6. And now these arrows, just like the red arrows on the previous slide, tell you who's sensing whom. So fish number 1 can sense 2, 2 can sense 1, 1 can sense 3, 3 cannot sense 1, 3 can sense 2, 2 cannot sense 3, etc. Okay? So at any given time, I could always write down, if I know who's sensing whom, I can always write down this. And so let's just say this is encoding the interconnections, who's sensing whom. Okay, we can do a little better than this. We can actually write down a whole array of numbers that more mathematically encodes this, okay? So for instance, if we have 4 guys and everybody's sensing everybody else, we would get an array of numbers that looks like this, with 1s and 3s in it. In this case, I have 4 guys. Now they can't sense everybody else. 1 can sense 4, 4 senses 3, 3 senses 2, 2 senses 1, in this kind of cycle. Okay, then we get a totally different looking array of numbers, and you see lots of zeros because there are a lot of individuals who can't sense each other. Okay, but these arrays of numbers basically encode for us who is sensing whom, and so this is really important to have a mathematical construct like this. Okay, so that's the first box. Second box, remember, was apply a rule. Okay, so individuals have to come up with a rule under which they're going to make decisions, and so these are the basic ingredients that we use in the context of these networks, these groups who are going to move together. And these come from, on the one hand, the kinds of rules that biologists believe animal groups like fish schools and bird flocks are obeying. But they also come from the kinds of rules that we need to derive for robotic agents because of practical concerns and practical limitations. Okay, so first of all, a big issue is that sensing is limited, right? Individuals can't see forever. We can't know everything. We can't even take in that much information. So we imagine that each individual in a flock and in a robotic network, if you have a sensor that's limited in how far you can see or maybe hear if you're underwater. So we imagine that individuals can only sense maybe a few local neighbors, those who are maybe close enough, some kind of distance-dependent neighbors. So not necessarily the entire group. And also, when you sense a neighbor, I don't know necessarily that this guy is heading north. I might just know how he's heading relative to me. He's heading a little bit to the right from where I'm heading. So I have a relative measurement of his motion. I don't have an absolute. I know he's over there relative to me, but I don't know where he is in a sort of an absolute way. And likewise, so those are measurements of neighbors, but also measurements of the environment. So if I'm trying to keep track of food, I have no idea what's over there. I just sort of know what I see along my path, right? I might not even know what's right over here if I can't sense that way, if I'm focused on my path. Okay, so we have to live with these kinds of limitations. So the other kind of limitation we live with, because this is the way these kinds of groups function, they function without leaders. So we have no central command. Nobody is kind of telling, okay, you fly this way, you fly this way, you fly this way. It's all done in a sort of decentralized way. So each individual makes its own decisions, okay, without sort of a command and control type of environment. And then finally, these are some of the basic rules that we actually encode in our decision making. And so in order for the group to stay cohesive, there are 2 very simple rules. One is that, when I look at my neighbors, I'm going to try to align with them. It kind of makes sense. If they're going this way and I want to stay with them, I should head in the same direction. I also probably want to attract, if I'm far away, I want to get a little bit closer, because if we get too spread apart, then I might lose the group. So an animal in these kinds of groups does not want to get lost. It's really scary to be off on your own. They probably won't make it. Then there's also, if anybody gets too close, of course I want to move away. So I think about repelling just because I want to avoid crashing into them. I don't want anybody too close, right? So there's this notion of cohesion and repulsion in the rules. Okay, so then the third box is act, right? We got to carry out these rules. And for our purposes today, let's imagine that our individuals are just moving on a flat surface, okay? In fact, this is kind of an overhead view. Now I'm back to 3 fish, 1, 2, and 3 in the red circles. When you're looking overhead at these 3 fish. And let's also assume for the moment that they're all moving at the same speed, and they're just going to stick with that speed. And so their big act is to just turn. So they got to figure out how they're going to steer, how fast they're going to steer, and in which direction. Okay? So, and because of the limited sensing, they have to figure out how they're going to steer as a function of, so it has to depend upon only what they can measure, which are these relative directions of motion, relative positions of nearby neighbors. Okay, so in this picture, what I've done is I've given a name to the direction of each of these guys. So, for example, fish number 1 is moving in direction defined by theta 1, which is basically the direction relative to moving in the east direction. Okay, so if he was moving due east, theta 1 would be 0. If he was moving due north, theta 1 would be 90 degrees, etc. Okay, and R1 is just the name I've given to where his position at this point in time. Okay, so here's here's fish number 2. So he's heading in direction theta 2, and he's at position R2. Okay, so for fish number 1, the relative direction of fish 2 with respect to himself is just theta 2 minus theta 1. The relative position is just R2 minus R1, just the difference between where they are and where I am. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about how we think about rules for how individuals behave, but remember, we're trying to make the connection between individuals and the group, so I need a way to talk about what's going on at the level of the group. How do we even describe the collective motion, right? And so I want to do this using this notion of synchrony, okay? So again, you're looking overhead, and now you're looking at overhead. These are 2 pictures of 12 individuals moving around, okay? They happen at this moment to have a constant steering rate, so everybody's just moving around in a circle, okay? But if you notice these guys over here, at this moment, so this is like a snapshot in their motion, everybody happens to be heading due east, right? And if they're moving at the same speed, they're going to be heading due north all at the same time. They're going to be heading due west all at the same time. So their directions are synchronized, okay? All 12 of them. Now I've done something additional here. Not only are their directions synchronized, but their position is synchronized. You might not be able to tell that, but all 12 of them are literally on top of each other. Okay, so this is an extra level of synchronization. I've synchronized, they're all heading the same direction, and they're in the exact same position. Okay, just to give you this notion of synchrony in the direction and synchrony in the position. Okay, so, given this notion of synchrony, we can think even a little bit more deeply about this in the following way. I really want to understand how to measure this. So if I looked at a group of fish, what could I say about their synchrony if they don't happen to be all moving in the same direction, for instance? Okay, and so one way we do this is, on this circle, what I've done is I've drawn those 3 heading directions of fish number 1, fish number 2, fish number 3. Okay, so these are the same angles we saw before. I've just put them all on the same plot here. And I have little red arrows going out to each direction. So if I take the average of those 3 red arrows, I get the black arrow, okay? And then what I'm doing is I'm calling the length of the black arrow is p theta, okay? The length of the black arrow. So it's the length of the black arrow, and I'll explain this in a moment. It's the length of the black arrow that gives me a measure of the synchrony, because look at these guys. Now, everybody is heading in the same direction, right? They're all on top of each other. So the average of the red arrow is just the same arrow again. And this is a circle of radius 1. So the length of this black arrow is 1, okay? That's the highest it can possibly be, right? If they're all distributed around, they're all for everybody going this way, somebody's going this way, then the average is going to be 0, right? They're all going to essentially cancel each other out or balance each other out. So I call this a balanced configuration. I call this a synchronized configuration. But here, I basically get 0. So the length of that arrow is 0. P theta is equal to 0. So here I have maximal synchrony, and here I have minimal synchrony. I can't get less synchronous than this. Okay? Now, what's even more interesting is, so now think about how heading relates to the speed of this group or the momentum of this group. Okay, so if they're all heading in the same direction and they're all going at the same speed, then basically they're going at the fastest speed as a group that they can possibly go. Right? The average of the group is going to be the speed of an individual. So this is, the idea of synchrony being, this parameter being maximized, it's also that the speed or the momentum of the group is being maximized. Likewise, suppose they're all moving around a circle so that when one guy's going here, another guy's going here, right, again, so all of their directions are balancing out, then what's going on spatially, the center of mass of this guy of this group isn't going anywhere. They're basically staying on the page, right? And so this p theta being 0, a measure of synchrony being minimized, it also reflects the fact that this group isn't going anywhere. The velocity is 0. Now, if you remember the video of the fish at the beginning, remember it was sort of moving, and then it went into this beautiful circle, and then it went off in this polarized motion again. These are pretty important kinds of motions, these two, right? And what's kind of interesting is that we have a parameter that distinguishes between the fish going like this and the fish going like this. And this parameter, it's maximal in this case and it's minimal in this case. So that's really rich and interesting for us. And I'll show you why. Because what it does is it actually immediately gives us a rule for deciding how an individual, or for telling an individual how to decide, or for an individual to decide how it's going to respond to what it measures. So we do something called taking the gradient of this synchrony parameter. So what does that mean? If I take the gradient of this with respect to theta 1, it basically gives me a formula for how I change my heading, if I'm fish number 1, so that I increase p theta. Okay, that's exactly what a gradient is. Okay? And so that's really what I want to do. Suppose I'm swimming around and I want to synchronize with these other fish because I want to move in the same direction. I should follow this rule because it'll tell me what to do. And what's really neat is that this rule is actually going to be a rule that depends upon relative directions, which is exactly what I have available to me. In fact, I can somehow generalize this p theta so that it includes this encoded network arrangement. So it includes the ability to encode who's sensing whom, so that when I take this gradient, I get a rule that not only allows me to synchronize, it does so using only relative headings of neighbors that I can sense that are within my environment. Okay. And so here's a sort of a simple way to see what this rule looks like. So if I have a particular agent, I look at the relative headings, I add them up. I take that sum and I divide by the total number of neighbors that I have. Okay? Then I multiply by some number. I'm just calling that number k theta. And I get a steering rate. If k theta, if that number I multiply by is positive, then I'm going to increase my synchrony. I'm following a rule to increase my synchrony. Right? And I get this kind of behavior where, okay, we're all moving around circles, but we're going to be moving around in the same direction. But if k theta, this number I put in front of this rule, is negative, then I balance all my directions so that the center of mass of the group will stay fixed. Okay? What's really nice is that this is a mathematical way in which I can actually prove that this will happen. I can guarantee that if you apply this rule, these are the kinds of behaviors that you'll get. Okay. So here's just a little tiny illustration of this just to give you a feel. Okay. So what I'm doing is showing you 3 fish on this clock. So, okay, one fish is heading towards 11 o'clock. Fish 2 is heading towards 7 o'clock, and fish 3 is heading towards 6 o'clock. And I'm just fish 2 and 3 are kind of oblivious. I'm just going to let fish 1 apply this rule and try to synchronize. Okay, so here's the rule that he should apply. And what I'm showing you is the p theta hill here, which we're going to be climbing. We're going to do better and better in synchrony by applying this rule. So here's the new theta 1. This is where I should be next heading in my next time step. So what do? I have to sum the relative headings, right? So 6 o'clock minus 11, 7 o'clock minus 11 o'clock. I sum them, then I divide by the number of individuals in the group. Okay, that's equivalent to just taking the average of all these headings. So if I add that all up, 11 plus 6 plus 7 gives me 24, divided by 3 gives me 8. Okay, so this guy should be heading, according to this rule, he moves to 8 o'clock. And guess what? I move up my hill. Okay, so I'm climbing this gradient. I apply the rule again. Okay, so now instead of 11, 6, and 7, I have 8, 6, and 7. That gives me 21. Divided by 3 gives me 7. The next step is I go to 7 o'clock, and so on. So this little guy is applying this rule and beginning to get more and more synchronized with his neighbor, and we're climbing this p theta hill. Okay, so but everything I've told you so far is just synchrony of the direction of motion. In fact, you saw these guys, okay, they're going around all these circles totally spread out. Yeah, they're heading in the same direction, but wouldn't it be nice if they were congregating like we see the fish schools doing, okay? And so what's really nice is that we can define something completely analogous to this synchrony of direction of motion to the spatial positioning of these guys. So we can have a spatial kind of synchrony. And what we do is define, I'll call it PS here, so S for spatial, analogous to P theta. And now I'm going to do the same kind of thing. I'm going to generalize it to include who I can sense, that L array. And I'll take the gradient again, and now it's going to give me a formula for how I change my heading, but now it's going to give me a formula for how I change my heading to spatially synchronize. And in this case, with everybody going around circles, what it's going to do is try to make everybody's circle centers coincident. So if you're going around a circle and I'm going around a circle, our circles are going to start to meet and then coincide. Okay? But it's the same analogous idea, and so let's see what happens when we apply this rule. So again, we're looking overhead at a bunch of individuals. So I'm doing nothing with respect to heading here. I'm just going to show you what happens when I turn on the number and I make it positive so that I increase synchrony in the spatial way. So now I have all these guys that, originally were going around their own independent circles, but now they're going around the same circle. Okay? There's nothing organized about which way they're heading because I haven't done anything. Okay? But now I turn on both. I want to synchronize so they're in the same circle, but now I want them also go in the same direction. That's how I get them all on top of each other, all on the same circle. Okay? Or I could synchronize them so they're on the same circle, but I could balance their headings by making the heading synchrony be completely unsynchronized, right? So now you see them going around the circle, but they're all, when one's going this way, somebody's going the other way on the opposite side of the circle, so that the center of the circle is just sitting there. So they're going around the circle, and the circle isn't drifting off anywhere. Okay, so again, there's this idea that we can actually use mathematics now to prove that these are the places that one converges to if you use these kinds of rules, which is really important to get a handle on. The other thing that's really nice is that we can distinguish these very different kinds of patterns with just two parameters. And in fact, it's just whether they're positive or negative numbers tells us whether we get these different kinds of patterns, right? But we can go even further with this. Whoops. Let me just stop it for a second. We can go even further with this in the following sense. We can go on and define more complex kinds of synchrony parameters so that, for instance, in the case where all these guys are balancing out, there's lots and lots and lots of different possibilities, right? If you have four guys, you could have two going this way and two going this way, or you could have one going this way, one going this way, one going this way, one going this way. I mean, there's lots and lots of different patterns, possibilities. And so what we'd like to do is be able to isolate, come up with rules so that they get into some really nice patterns. Okay? And so what I'm showing you here is a generalization of what I showed you with more of these synchrony parameters, so that we can do and prove that we get to these very spatially distributed patterns that are very rich and interesting. And so in this movie, so again we're looking overhead and we're looking again at 12 individuals. The red circles are the positions in time, and you see the little arrows, that's where they're heading. And the blue lines show you where they've been, okay? And I started them all off identically. Same positions, same initial directions of motion. They were all going at constant speed. And they're all using the same fundamental law, same fundamental rule, based on relative heading and relative position measurements. However, I've changed some of these parameters, whether they're positive or negative, so that I can distinguish these different patterns. And so I'll just show you that these are 6 different patterns for 12 different individuals. And if we wait long enough, you'll see that all 12 of these, they're going to synchronize, same position, same heading, all on top of each other. Here, we're going to see 2 groups of 6 emerge. So 6 are going to going this way on the circle, and 6 are going on this as they move around. Here, we've got 3 groups of 4, 4 groups of 3, 6 groups of 2, and now here, all 12 of them uniformly distributed as they move around. So again, this is really nice, and this is really useful because now we have this whole family that we can say, given these rules, these are the patterns we're going to get to, all kinds of patterns. And they come about from this very small set of parameters with very simple changes in these parameters. So we can do things like look at animal groups, if we can keep track of which way they're heading. We can compute the synchrony parameter, and then we could even think about reverse engineering, backing out what might be plausible rules that individuals are obeying that led to those patterns that we observe. Likewise, we can think about design. We can say, well, we want this pattern. Like, I want this pattern in the ocean because it's going to be really useful for maximizing the information that I collect when I'm searching around for oceanographic data. Okay, so I have a pattern that I've chosen, and now I can immediately back out a rule. A very simple rule, a rule that only maybe depends on near neighbors, and one that I can provably say will get me the kinds of patterns that I'm looking for. So in fact, we take it, you can keep adding further extensions, and I want to show you this one because this is the one we actually used in the ocean experiments that we did in Monterey Bay. Whoops, I got to turn it on. So this is, again, 12 individuals, okay? But now they have a different, they're sensing different individuals for different purposes. So when they sense relative position, the four guys on top, they can only sense each other for relative position. The four guys in the middle, they're sort of like a local sensor for relative position. The four guys in the middle are going to organize. Let me turn it on. Whoops. The four guys in the middle are sensing relative position, so they're moving on their own little loop. The four guys in the bottom are moving on their own little loop. However, across the groups, somebody can see a little further distance when it comes to relative direction. Because you see that these three guys are all heading south at the same time. There's four groups of three, right, in terms of the heading directions. But there's 3 groups of 4 in terms of the positions, right? And so we can come up with these very nice patterns, and this one happens to be one that's very effective when you're trying to collect data, because now you can make individuals stay a certain distance from one another. When you collect data, you don't want robots to get on top of each other, because then they're going to measure the same thing, and it's a real waste of resource, right? We don't want redundancy necessarily, right? But they're also coming back, because you take a measurement, say you measure temperature, you measure something about the plankton. That might be useful for a little while, but maybe you want to come back in a few hours because things have changed and you really want to know how things are changing in time. So these patterns have proved to be really useful. And so we actually implemented these very algorithms in the ocean with a network of these actually really lovely robotic vehicles, which we call underwater gliders. So these are autonomous, these are submersibles that move around on their own. They have sensors on them, so they do exactly what we want. They have computers on them, so they make decisions on their own. So they form, we have a whole group of these, and they form a group in the sense that we're defining here. They're really beautiful things. They're about 1.5 meters long. They're like this big in diameter. They're just packed with sensors to measure the ocean. And they have no propellers. They have minimal moving parts on the outside, because the idea is that these go in the water for very long periods of time, weeks and weeks, without having to recharge batteries, and stuff grows in the ocean. So if you have a surface that's going to move and something grows on it, then you might not be able to move it, and then you wouldn't be able to control the way it wouldn't be able to control how it wanted to move. So what they do is they have the little wings that you see, and they change their weight. So they pump so that it can change weight, and so they make themselves heavy and they glide down. They make themselves light, they glide up. This guy has a rudder, so it can turn. Some of them have a weight inside that you can move, so that it will roll and bank and turn. So you can move around in 3D, but your basic motion is to do so kind of like this, which is really great for collecting data. The challenge is that they move very slowly. I mean, that's why they're endurance vehicles, and they get pushed around by the currents, as you'll see at what happened in our experiment. So in this field experiment, we basically use these control laws to automate. We let these guys basically follow these kinds of patterns that I've showed you. In fact, we changed the patterns on them. So we kind of like, when we decided that different things were going on in the ocean, we would basically stop their routine, change out the pattern, and then they would go on by themselves, implementing these very, very rules that I just showed you. So It's kind of unprecedented. We were able to have these guys work on their own for almost 24 days straight. These guys were doing them, and they're kind of unbelievable workhorses, collecting unbelievable amounts of data. And in fact, we work with ocean modelers who take the data that we collect and make forecasts about ocean temperature and ocean currents and ocean biology while this is all going on. So this is a pretty large-scale kind of operation. But let me just sort of show you these guys now in the ocean. So you're looking at the data now. You're looking at the motion of these 6 of these yellow guys. So here's the pattern that we start out with at the beginning. So these 2 red guys are supposed to be moving around the top loop. The green guys are supposed to be moving around the green loop, and the 6th guy had to go out of the water there, so the 5th, this guy's moving around here. The gray lines tell you who's sensing whom, so who's dancing with whom at a particular moment. Okay? And, you can see that now you can see that the who's dancing with whom has changed. Oh, the challenging part you see is in the background, those little arrows, is an estimate of what the currents look like. Okay, and they're color-coded for a reason. When they get red, it means that they're as large or larger than the forward speed of these vehicles. So they're trying to do, sometimes they just can't even move in the direction that they're trying to go. And you can see how we've changed the pattern. This was at the end. We wanted to collect data over the head of the canyon, and so the pattern changed, but we still, because we have this sort of systematic way of generating patterns, you just change the pattern. It knew exactly how to regenerate its rule based on the new pattern that it was told at the beginning. Okay, so there's that story of how we think about using these kinds of mathematical models and tools to do design. Now I want to show you an example of how we would then go and do sort of the reverse engineering problem when we observe animal groups, how then we back out a plausible rule for what these animals might be doing. Okay, so this is actually data from fish. So these are called danio, so they're little tiny fish. And so what you're looking at in this first example is 4 fish moving around in this tank. And if you watch them long enough, you'll see that they spend a lot of time kind of moving together in the same direction. Not always, but a while. Okay, and so what you can do, this is data that we can take, we know from the data where they're heading. So we can compute this synchrony measure because we have all of the angles, theta 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Okay, so what I'm showing you over here for this data set is a histogram of the synchrony measure, okay? So when the synchrony measure is over here, it refers to the group being synchronized. When it's over here, it refers to the group being completely unsynchronized, being balanced. And what this histogram is showing you is how often over that whole run it was at this value versus this value, okay? So when there's a peak here, which there is, it says that for, a goodly portion of the time, these guys were moving synchronized, as we just saw, okay? There was other things going on. This actually refers to 3 of them going one way and 1 going the other way, which happens. This guy would go around and then come back with a group. And now if we compare that to another run with these same fish, except now there's 8 of them. So this is, for whatever reason, these guys just stopped moving together. And they started doing this much more diffusive pattern. Okay, so they're not moving in a circle, they're just sort of milling around, but they're not really going anywhere. And if you do the exact same thing, you take this data, the headings, you compute the synchrony parameter, you never see synchrony, just like you never see it here. In fact, you see that most of the time this thing is just balanced. The center of mass isn't going anywhere. Okay? So we can actually, we could stop it at a particular moment, we could figure out a plausible kind of rule that the fish might be obeying at that moment, because we could design a rule that would respect what neighbors they could see, etc. Okay, so that's a nice mathematical framework and some examples of how we used it. So I want to head toward concluding by talking about a couple of sort of fun directions that we're taking these kinds of modeling and analysis tools and framework. So this is an example of some data. So now you're looking at a school of 2 fish, and I'll show you this is just data, these two fish, and what you see in this plot above is their speed, okay? And as you can see in the movie, they're speeding up and slowing down and speeding up and slowing down, but when one guy speeds up, the other guy slows down, so they're moving relative to one another as they move along, okay? Which is really kind of interesting. And so we're trying to explore what it is that they're regulating. But one interesting thing I just want to show you is that if you do that and you go around a curve, so think about like runners on a track. If somebody accelerates, they go out in front, and if someone decelerates, they go in back. And so sure enough, if you use this very same framework that I've showed you, but now you allow individuals to oscillate, so they speed up and slow down, but they don't do it, when one is speeding up, the other isn't speeding up. You do it so that it's a little bit of a cycle. Then, if it's perfectly sinusoidal, you get this beautiful pattern where the animals, would be, or the robots would be moving, in this case, around their circle, trying to align themselves, but essentially taking turns, who's in front, who's sort of safe inside the curve, who's in the back, can see everybody, who's exposed. Right? And in terms of robots, if they were measuring, say, the boundary of the BP oil spill, we'd get really nice data because everybody would spend time on both sides of the boundary and we'd get really rich kinds of data. So that's one really interesting problem. Another one is looking at the problem of, say, a whole bunch of individuals that are moving together, and suppose some of them, some of the older, wiser fish think the food's over here and some of the others think it's over here. What happens to the group? They want to stick together. Do they make the good decision to go in one or the other of these good directions, or do they do something silly like compromise and go, sort of split the difference? And so we use this kind of framework to study this kind of problem. Do they go in one direction? Do they go in the other direction? Or do they do the silly thing, which is to make no good decision? They're kind of compromising. Okay. And the third example is sort of extending these ideas to think about these problems that I talked about at the beginning, which are how do these animals move together and respond in a way that's so incredibly, responsive to the external world. So here you're looking at thousands of starlings in a flock. This is in Italy over the Rome train station, in the presence of a falcon, so you'll see their predators nearby. And what happens is that this group is doing these aerial robotics. They're kind of like in a pancake shape. But they never ever split. So somehow they're incredibly responsive, and yet they don't fall apart. They don't go in separate ways. Okay? And so we use these same kind of tools to ask questions like who's sensing whom? How many neighbors might an individual be paying attention to do a good job here? So these are the kinds of things we can use these same kinds of mathematical tools to answer. Okay, finally, I want to just show you a couple ways in which we're actually coming back from our studies to ask new questions through new experiments, behavioral experiments with animals. In this case, this is a sort of a fun robotic test bed where we have introduced fake fish with real fish so that we can run controlled experiments. So, for instance, you could have a fake fish turn and see how the rest of the group responds, or you could have a fake fish be a predator and see how the group responds to different kinds of predation strategies. And so we do that by making casts of already dead fish, mounting them on little stands, using a little bit of water, raising the tank off the ground, putting a robot underneath every fake fish with a magnet between them so that the robot drags this fake guy around. We have a camera which videotapes this whole thing. In real time, we track the video so that we can tell the robot where its neighbors are through the camera, through the computer, back to the robot. So he can function according to these rules that we give it, either as a predator or as another one of the group. And so this is just a little demo. Someone's just filming the scary predator running through these they're called golden shiners, the fish. And here's a video so you can kind of see the real-time processing that we do. So that, I don't know if you can see, there's a green circle that in real time we're computing so that we can do things like figure out what the boundary of the school is so that the predator can come up with an algorithm to figure out, like, does it want to head for the closest guy? Does it want to just head for some point on the boundary? Or maybe compute the angular rotation of the group. Maybe when it's spinning at a certain rate, then it's ready to approach. These kinds of things. Okay, and one last example of things that we're doing. So this is actually a collaboration of mine with a choreographer. So we had this idea to think about connections. This is sort of an art science project, thinking about connections between collective motion as we think about it in natural groups like fish and birds, and then what happens if you take dancers in particular who've been trained to be very much physically aware, who you can give lots of rules to and see what happens. It gives us kind of an extra, it's beautiful and interesting, but it also gives us kind of an extra insight, because in the case of the fish and the birds, we'll never really know exactly who they're paying attention to, whereas with the dancers, we can tell them who to pay attention to. So we can know something in advance about who's sensing whom. So let me just show you a little clip from that. This is a group of professional dancers in New York, my collaborator company, Susan Marshall and Company, who are carrying out these rules where they're trying to stay close to two neighbors, so it's trying to stay arm's length, and then they're trying to not let anybody else come closer than arm's length. And then you'll see one guy is going to play the role of a predator at the end. There he goes. Right. And so here's, we've done some experiments with these. I taught a course actually last fall with Susan, and we had students doing this. And this is an experiment where we tracked what they were doing, and then we can figure out over the course of the motion who's sensing whom and how it's changing, and we can start to ask some really interesting questions, like were certain people exhibiting more influence on the group, and why? Did it depend upon where they were in the group, or maybe just what their personality was like? Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I want to acknowledge these are some of the members of my research group who are responsible for lots of this work, and they're fantastic. So thank you.
I'm sure that Professor Leonard would entertain one or two questions. Anybody else?
Have you done any work with insects, social insects?
I'm starting to do a little bit of work with trying to understand a new mechanism that's been discovered in honeybees. So related to, I don't know if you know about the waggle dance. So the honeybees do the waggle dance, and the biologists have identified a new mechanism called the stop signal. So instead of just, so you know about this. So we're working with some folks who are doing some modeling there. But it's a different story, because the social insects are not selfish like the fish and the birds. So they're trying to work together and trying to, they just function differently than the, maybe you know more than me, but they function differently than the selfish individuals. Yep. Okay.
Okay, well, no further questions then. I think we should thank Dr. Leonard again.
Thanks.
The natives were getting restless up there.